From silver screen to sideshow, the next 45 minutes are going to be filled with some unbelievable acquisitions. If at any time you guys need to share a moment on social, because a lot of this you have to see to believe, please be sure to tag us and hashtag believe it or not. We'll also be taking questions live after this panel on our Twitch channel and Facebook page. And you guys are all welcome to join us and literally ask us anything. I'm Sabrina Seek, Ripley's creative content manager, but without further ado, the real deal, our panelists. First up, we've got Colton Cruz, and Colton's Ripley's digital content producer. Hey, Colton.
How's it?
Going good. Now, Colton gets his hands dirty in a lot of our best exhibits through Ripley's Rarities, and those are short videos that we share on social, highlighting what makes each piece of our collection truly unique. My favorite one is the woolly mammoth tooth, which I feel like that texture is crazy, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, but I really want to know what a century egg tastes like, because
Yeah, century eggs are they're about as bad as a century-old egg. It's salty, it's gross, the smell is something you can't get rid of, but yeah, interesting stuff for sure.
yeah, no thank you. Next up, we have Ripley Publishing editor, Jordi Orlando. And Jordi really brings our brand story to life through our books, and especially the Ripley's Annual. She researches them, writes them, and edits them, the whole shebang. So thank you for joining us, Jordi.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's definitely not a one-woman show. I get a lot of help from everyone, but yeah, it's so much fun putting the books together.
Absolutely. And last but not least, we've got Ripley's exhibit buyer, Curtis Molman. Now, Curtis kind of has the keys to the castle when it comes to buying some of our most prized possessions. He also has that tricky task of verifying their authenticity, which is something I don't envy. You're spending some big bucks sometimes, Curtis, right?
Oh yeah, yep. We have exhibits that range from a couple of $100 to the Maryland dress at $5 million. We've got everything in between.
Wild. Well, thank you all for joining me, and thank you everyone at home for watching today. Before we dive into the gems in the vault, let's talk about the Ripley exhibit collection as a whole. Jordi, now, I know you had a hand in the 100-year anniversary book that we did, which was probably our biggest foray into researching our past and really diving into our archives and kind of telling that story as a whole. You're really well versed there. Where did Believe It or Not start, and where did kind of our exhibit collection get its root?
Yeah, so the 100 Years book was a huge task because, our archiving wasn't as great back then as it is today. So there was a lot of research, a lot of verification, even Robert Ripley himself gave different dates for his birthday. So we had to try and track what his actual birthday was. So a lot of people watching right now, they may not be aware of how long Ripley's has actually been around. Maybe you know us from our TV shows or our books or the auditoriums, but we started as a newspaper cartoon just over 100 years ago. And Robert Ripley actually started as a sports cartoonist at the New York Globe. And back then they didn't have sophisticated cameras to capture moments in sports that go by in the flash of an eye. So newspapers would hire these cartoonists to attend events and draw these important moments from the game or the boxing match or whatever. So show their readers, this is what happened and this is what it was like. And Ripley, he was a huge sports guy. In fact, if it wasn't for an injury, he may have ended up playing professional baseball instead of drawing it. And, back then sports was just a huge part of pop culture. And, it still is today, but not back then. You don't have your Babe Ruths and stuff like that, following. I mean, you kind of do, like Michael Jordan and Kobe and all that stuff, you follow it, but it was just huge in pop culture back then. And so anyways, it was 1918. It was a slow news day, not much going on. And so Robert Ripley was just well, what am I going to put in the cartoon? So he's going through his desk and he finds all these weird athletic feats that he had gathered over the years, like a man walking backwards across the United States, just using a mirror, or what was another one? Someone hopping 100 times in 12 seconds or something like that. It was really weird stuff. And so he put all these facts into a panel called Champs and Chumps. And people liked it, so he kept doing it. And a few months down the line, he renamed it Believe It or Not. And that's like a little Believe It or Not I like too, that, Believe It or Not wasn't originally called Believe It or Not. It was Champs and Chumps. Anyways, so the cartoon's actually still running today. So shout out to John Graziano, who is currently just the seventh artist to take up that Ripley's pen and draw the Believe It or Not cartoon. So anyways, now that this Believe It or Not concept is so popular, his newspapers are like sending him across like the world to gather these weird facts. And while he's traveling, he's not just drawing, he's also buying stuff up and bringing souvenirs back home to his home in New York, which he named Bion Island, which BION stands for Believe It or Not. So if you hear one of us, say Bion, that's what it means. And a lot of it was, cultural artifacts like idols, masks from Africa, shrunken heads from Ecuador. Can't forget the shrunken heads, that sort of thing. But he also got like really random stuff like a whale's ear or Jesse James's gun, and also a vase covered in human skin. And he did this for years, built up a massive collection, which eventually became like the basis for the Ripley collection today. And now we've got like 30 museums filled with stuff.
That's wild. I think a couple things just stuck out to me there. I have questions. Like I said, everyone at home is going to have questions. First of all, like Robert Ripley was kind of an underdog himself. So it's weird to think of him also as like a sports guy, right? The way I justify that in my head is I know he's got that handball history and he legitimately wrote the book on handball. Like,
Yes.
Where did that come from and how did that play a role? Also, there's that amazing quote. You know the one.
Okay. I'm so glad you brought that up. My favorite Robert Ripley quote. Okay, if you don't know what handball is, it's exactly what it sounds like. You're basically like in a room and you're just slapping a ball with your hand. And my favorite Robert Ripley quote of all time is, "There's nothing more natural than slapping a ball with a hand." And he just loved the sport. He like got multiple trophies and awards for it. And, he was a very athletic dude in his earlier years.
Wild stuff. I love how that's how like that's my favorite Robert Ripley quote. Not like I traveled to so many countries and the strangest thing I saw was man. Like no, it's a ball in hand, no big deal. But the other thing that stuck out was did you say like a human skin vase lamp situation?
Yeah, I actually don't know a lot of history behind that acquisition on his part. It's just one of the many weird things that he got. Like another famous exhibit that he brought home was something called the Masakichi statue. And it's this statue that a man created of himself out of wood. And it is so detailed that it looks like it's a real person. The artist used like his actual fingernails and hair from his head. And you can't even tell like where the seams of the wood meet. And it's a beautiful piece of work. But, Robert Ripley was kind of a prankster. So he would take this statue and like hide it in closets in his house for like people to find when they open the door and like scare the living daylights out of them because it looks like a real person.
God. My favorite part of the Masakichi story is that he found it in a bar. It was literally just bar decoration. And the bar owner was like, yeah, this is the story. Like, what bar are you going to, Robert Ripley? Like, this is weird. This is not okay. This is not normal. All of that said, Curtis, from this history that Jordy's kind of dove into a little bit to today, how has our collection evolved? Like, we've got all these pop culture items. You've got Indiana Jones's whip behind you, which seems like some OG Ripley, crystal skulls, jeweled skulls, shrunken heads and all. But how do things like, the Back to the Future props behind you and other pop culture stuff play a part into Believe It or Not 100 years later?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, when it comes to these pop culture items, we like to find, or we like to display not only the item itself, but also talk about a Believe It or Not fact about the item. It varies piece by piece. A lot of people know about the lightsaber that we have. So the lightsaber was made out of a Graflex camera. Colton's going to discuss that in further detail, I know. Same kind of concept for the blaster. It just depends on the piece. We focus on a piece. We try to find some sort of believe it or not fact about it, so that we can display the item and the fact. And basically, when it boils down to it, we're looking to display something you can't see anywhere else. And if it fits that criteria, it belongs in a Ripley's, in our opinion.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And you're right. I think it's fair to say some of the most notable acquisitions in the realm of pop culture that we've made recently have come from the Star Wars franchise. And I'm guessing our viewers at home would kind of like to get up close and personal with those blasters and the lightsabers. So, Colton, you're our expert there after this May the 4th Twitch stream that we did. Can you kind of show us a little bit of what we got?
Yeah, I definitely think we've made people wait long enough. We'll get straight to it. So I've got my gloves on because again, these are our high dollar, high value exhibits. First one we'll look at is actually Luke Skywalker's lightsaber. So this one, I mean, there is debate around this. I know this is Comic-Con, so deciding whether it's Luke Skywalker's lightsaber, Anakin's lightsaber, Rey Skywalker's lightsaber, who knows? I'll leave that for you guys for either our Q&A or in a kind of commentary. But this is the lightsaber that was used in Empire Strikes Back. It was used in the scene in the snow on Hoth where he was, captured by the Wampa, and he force pulls it out of there, kind of flexing that force power for one of the first kind of most visual times on screen for us. And again, besides it being something that has, all of this cultural importance of being something that's a part of, the most iconic sci-fi movie of all time, of being a part of, I would say even American cinema, one of the most iconic parts of American cinema. There's something to be said about, the lightsaber representing, everything there is about Hollywood and entertainment and, like being a geek. And, there's a believe it or not story based on it, kind of being in the movies itself. You'll notice here that there are rivets on these fins. These fins actually had the rivets added during Empire Strikes Back because when the lightsaber prop was sitting in the snow, the metal would contract and shrink. It broke off the glue, and these fins would actually just fall right off in Mark Hamill's hands when he picked it up. So they added these rivets, and that actually ended up being something that was added to the lightsaber for the fictitious universe going forward. So that's an interesting piece of kind of the movie Hollywood magic kind of meeting what we see as a huge cultural icon. But another thing about this lightsaber, I'll set it down for just a second, is the way it was made at all is also a believe it or not story as well. Some of you might have noticed this camera that's been sitting behind me this whole time. I'm just going to grab it real quick.
Looks a little heavy.
It is very heavy. It is, not as small as our modern cell phone cameras we might be carrying around today. So this is a Graflex Dogger type camera. And if you look at it closely, something about it might seem a little familiar. If you look at the flash handle here, be careful again because it's very heavy. This is actually what they ended up making the lightsaber prop out of in the first movie. I'll see if I can hold it up here as a reference. But you got everything from that red button on the back to the fins on the side. They obviously, added a little bit of accoutrement to make it look a little bit more sci-fi. But on this one, you can actually even clearly see that it says Graflex here above my thumb. Hopefully you guys can see that on camera. Set it back down. But actually on the lightsaber prop itself, we also have the word Graflex. Now, of course, for filming, that was covered up by foil tape. But it goes to show that something as simple and everyday and something everybody can connect to, like a flash handle on a camera, can become, again, cinema's most powerful and iconic symbol in movies today.
Wild.
Now, yeah, I mean, it goes to the same thing. Now, the Han Solo blaster, believe it or not, is actually our most expensive Star Wars purchase to date. It actually cost us more to acquire this than it did the lightsaber. And you'll see, it's actually based on a model pistol that was, kind of had these, again, sci-fi kind of elements added to it. And I've actually got, somewhere here, I've actually got the regular model that it was modeled from here as well. It's a cap gun pistol made by MGC. It's a Mauser-style pistol from 1916 in Germany. And again, the look is exactly the same. They just added kind of, the sci-fi elements to give it that Star Wars feel. On our model, you'll actually even notice it's in pretty rough condition. This was actually used in the film Return of the Jedi, the end of the sequel or the end of the original trilogy there. And Harrison Ford is notoriously rough with his props. And this one was one of 2 non-firing props they had for the movie. And because it's in such rough condition, we're pretty sure this is the one he used for the majority of filming until he kind of, busted up the scope here. And then he switched to the fresh one for the rest of filming. Now, Curtis actually has behind him Harrison Ford's whip from Indiana Jones, and kind of talking about that rough with props and stuff. It's actually made from kangaroo leather because it is tougher than the other things. But all of this really just is to say that the story of something being, a cultural icon and that being something, you can't see anywhere else, and that's what you want to go to a Ripley's Believe It or Not and see an item for. When you dig into that story, you'll find all of these other interesting, believe it or not, things, all these things that are wondrous and different about the world. And really, that's why they belong in the Ripley's collection, kind of amongst all of our ethnographic ephemera and artifacts. These things really do belong. I mean, what goes better next to a shrunken head than the Indiana Jones whip?
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more there. But I think what also makes it believe it or not is that they were screen used. They are real. But that's something we have to verify. So, Curtis, you played a big role in the lightsaber and the blaster acquisition and, a lot of our high dollar value items that have come in recently. How do you verify the authenticity of items like these?
That's a great question. It depends. It depends on the piece, and it varies exhibit by exhibit. For example, the lightsaber, that one we actually purchased at auction, and it came out of Gary Kurtz's personal collection. So not only did it come with a nice certificate of authenticity that was signed by Gary, but it had rock solid provenance all the way back to the movie. So the lightsaber was a really good example with that, but it's not always that simple. Sometimes you have to dive a little bit deeper into an exhibit and do your own research. An example I'd love to give is a while ago, somebody contacted us and apparently had the wooden gun that John Dillinger escaped from prison with. Now, for those of you who don't know the story of John Dillinger, very famous American mobster, actually the reason why the FBI's most wanted list was created. He was the first person on there as number 1. He was a bad guy that the FBI wanted to get a hold of. Well, so they got a hold of him, and he was in prison. And long story short, he escaped using a wooden gun that he apparently carved out of a washboard inside of the prison. So if that's not funny enough, it was he faked his way out of prison basically with the wooden gun. The wooden gun got him out of his cell into the armory, where he was then able to get real weapons. But it did the trick to get him from A to B. There are, I would say, conspiracy theories about that. Some people think that he did carve the wooden gun out of the washboard. There was a washboard found that was missing pieces of wood. So some people believe that that's the story. That's how it happened. Some people think that was put there as a distraction, and an outside gun was brought in. That there's another theory that a person in Chicago created a little bit better looking wooden gun than what could have been created in prison, and it was smuggled in via a guard, and the washboard was left as a kind of throw everybody off, so no one suspected that a guard was in on it.
Like and a red herring, kind of.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. And then there's a third theory that a guard just gave him a real gun and they left the washboard there with all the wood. And so there's kind of 3 theories that float around with that event. And so if we could have gotten the wooden gun, it obviously would have been a fantastic acquisition for us. But I talked to several experts for about a week. I became an honorary John Dillinger expert. I talked to people who believed in every theory out there, whether they believed in the true wooden gun theory, whether they believed in the external wooden gun theory, whether they believed in the guard giving him a real gun theory. Talk to everybody. People have written books, have been on TV, and the consensus across all 3 of the experts was, they all had a different opinion on how it happened, but they all kind of came to the same conclusion that there was just no way that gun could have been the wooden gun it was supposed to be. And it was kind of one of those pieces where it was disappointing because I would have loved to have had it. But when you've got three different people who believe three different things all coming to the same conclusion, it just wasn't in the cards for that piece, unfortunately.
Is that something you kind of follow and see where that exhibit ended up and whose hands it landed in?
Yes, it again depends on the piece. If it's a private seller, sometimes it's a little bit more difficult because they'll reach out to us and they'll say, hey, do you want it? And then unfortunately, if we have to deliver bad news, it's not anything that I enjoy doing. But sometimes it's well, it's just not for us, and it goes on to the next person. But if it's an auction, perhaps that we're following, we definitely keep close eyes on it. Like, for example, if we're looking into an auction and purchasing an item and we don't get it, we definitely take note of how much it went for. If we can figure out who got it, we note that as well, because it's not just about what we get, but it's also about knowing the players of the game and knowing that, if I go and want to buy another lightsaber, I need to know what I should be paying for another lightsaber, or whatever item that may be. So we keep track whenever possible.
Definitely, that totally checks out. So this is Ripley's. Everything is 100% real. We've gone through the provenance side and authenticity side of everything. But, sometimes you got to take that realness with a grain of salt. And I'm only saying that because I see the hoverboard behind you, Curtis. And
Yep.
you told me, I think you've told me it's real before.
I wish it was real. We were supposed to have these in 2015, according to the movie. So I don't know why we don't have them yet. But as everybody knows, in 1989, Robert Zemeckis took us all on a little adventure with Doc Brown and Marty McFly from 1985 to 2015. And apparently in 2015, we were all supposed to have hoverboards, but it hasn't happened yet. So this is an original hoverboard that was used in Back to the Future 2. Most specifically, this was used anytime Marty McFly kind of carried it under his arm. Basically, this was kind of the one he ran around with. There were a few different versions that were made, and they were all made a little bit differently. A few of them had on the bottom a rudimentary spring. It was basically a warped piece of metal that was on the bottom, so that when Michael J. Fox would throw the hoverboard, it would kind of bounce, give that hover effect that you see in the movie. It doesn't actually hit the ground. A few of them had wheels on the bottom of them, so that it was used for faraway shots and above shots, making it look like he was hovering. But this one's fully finished on the front and the back, and was pretty much used anytime you saw him running around when it wasn't on the floor. And then, going back to the more Back to the Future stuff, something else we were supposed to have is some self-tying shoes. Now, these are a little bit more in the realm of possibility. In fact, Nike has released special edition shoes and whatnot that actually do self-tie. But this is an original pair of self-tying shoes from Back to the Future 2. And these were used anytime Marty McFly was running around with the shoes. These were not the shoes that actually self-tied themselves. The shoes that self-tied themselves on screen, not too many people know, but he was actually on a platform and there were people underneath him pulling on strings to make the shoes self-tie. It was not just an electronic package built into the shoes that you see nowadays. It was a true Hollywood effect created by a bunch of people off camera pulling on strings and whatnot to make these laces self-tie. So these ones were basically the static ones anytime Michael J. Fox just had them on running around. So these ones were from that, and they do light up and whatnot. They're in okay shape for being 30-some years, but you also have to remember when they were filming these movies, nobody expected Back to the Future to be this cultural phenomenon that it is today. It was different back then. Props were made differently. They weren't made to last. They weren't made to last 30 years. Nowadays it's a little different, especially when, the next Star Wars movie comes out, they know it's going to be this mega phenomenon. But back then, it just wasn't on their radar. It was make the prop and use it, and if something happened, whatever survived, kind of.
Wow, I love that kind of Hollywood magic with a whole crew of people. I feel like, does that even happen still these days? That's kind of cool. But even that and the story behind these props, they're great. But Jordy, when it comes to you, it's really your role to kind of extend those stories a bit more and give them a little more, believe it or not, oomph behind them, right? Like, we can collect some really, really cool stuff, but how do we really translate it into a believe it or not story?
Right. So, I mean, I personally love this kind of stuff. I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I love Back to the Future. So for me, just like seeing and holding these props, that's like an unbelievable experience for me. But, not everyone is a fan of Star Wars. Not everyone is a fan of Back to the Future. So you have to give something to them that makes it a believe it or not. Just because I feel like a Jedi holding Luke Skywalker's lightsaber doesn't mean it's a believe it or not. So part of my job is to dig deeper, and I work with that information that Curtis provides and finds as he's, checking the provenance on these exhibits. And that's like a jumping off point for me to find the believe it or not. And, culturally significant films like Back to the Future and Star Wars, Indiana Jones, those, have some really interesting stories behind the props. And, it's what it's made out of, like what Colton was saying, like with the lightsaber and the Graflex camera, or the inspiration behind it. And in some cases, it's even what happened to it after it was used in the movie. And a really exciting example of this was something that Curtis just recently bought. And it's Norman Bates's front door from the 1960 Alfred Hitchcock film, Psycho. It's actually the 60th anniversary of the film this year. And it was based off of a book of the same name, written by Robert Bloch. And he lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, less than 50 miles away, and at the same time as Ed Gein, and notorious serial killer, human skin wearer. He was living less than 50 miles away from where Ed Gein committed all those atrocities. And it was those heinous acts that inspired Robert Bloch to write Psycho and the character of Norman Bates. And so after this movie was filmed, like the next year, the door ended up in like a creepily appropriate place. It actually ended up at the entrance of a funeral home in, believe it or not, Rib Lake, Wisconsin. R-I-B, like human body part, Rib Lake, Wisconsin, at a funeral home less than 2 hours away from where Ed Gein lived. And apparently the funeral director just like thought it matched the Victorian style of his funeral home very nicely. I mean, it's a nice door.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it is a nice door, but again, it's that little known information and that serendipity that leaves your mind totally blown on it. Curtis, was all of that information available to you when you made the purchase, or were you looking at it from it's the 60th anniversary? I know you're a big horror buff, so I feel like that probably played a little part into that. What was kind of your background information on why you made that purchase?
You're correct. I was familiar with Psycho, obviously, before this door came up for auction. I've read the book. I know about all, Ed Gein and the story behind it. And so I kind of, just in the back of my head, had all these little, believe it or not, facts stored away for it. And part of my job is to research upcoming events. And Sabrina, you know this, we work hand in hand with this. We're doing a certain amount of planning ahead. We know that the 60th anniversary of Psycho is this year, so that's a great leaping point for that. But we also know that there's a ton of, believe it or not, facts about the movie. Jordy talked about a few, and just that the fact that the door ended up in Wisconsin, where Ed Gein was from, and that's what inspired the whole thing is fantastic to me. But there's also a bunch of like other little things about Psycho. Believe it or not, Psycho was the first movie ever to show a flushing toilet on camera. Before that, the censor was a lot different back then, as you can imagine. When Alfred Hitchcock took Psycho to the censor, there were 3 scenes that the censor was most concerned about. He was most concerned about the very opening scene when Marion is laying in bed with her boyfriend. They were also most concerned about the shower scene, naturally. And they were most concerned about showing a toilet flush because it had never been shown before. So you can imagine how just strange that sounds, right? I mean, you've got you would consider blood and gore next to a toilet flushing, and they're considering them in the same category. So long story short, Hitchcock did some fancy footwork and said, if you let me leave the shower scene the way it is, I'll let you come and refilm the opening scene. And the censor bought it and then just never showed up. So Hitchcock kept it the way that it was anyway. And then there's a lot of like behind the scenes, kind of byons. There were over 53 shots in the shower scene alone. It was purposely filmed in black and white, even though color was available at the time, because Alfred Hitchcock knew that he wanted to show blood, but knew that the censor wouldn't let him show that amount of blood on camera. So by making it black and white and using Hershey syrup instead, he was able to show blood, but not have the censor be worried about all this red on screen. So there were a lot of things about the movie that were strategic. Alfred Hitchcock knew what he was doing. He was financing the movie himself. He had his whole, he took out a second mortgage on his house and all sorts of things. I mean, it all came down to this. He knew what he was doing. He knew how it had to be, how it had to work. He had the vision, and it obviously paid off. We're still talking about it 60 years later.
And I'm never going to be able to look at chocolate syrup the same. So thank you, Curtis. After kind of talking about, plenty of serial killers already, human skin vases, I'm a little nervous to ask this next question to you all, but I'd love to know what your favorite exhibits are from the collection and kind of what is it about them? Is it their story? Is it where you found it? Is it a personal connection? So Jordy, let's go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, so working on the publishing side, I'm a little biased, and I find myself drawn to this comic book. It is one of the rarest comic books ever printed. Some consider it the holy grail of comic book collecting. And the reason why is because it is a first edition trade paperback of Marvel's Squadron Supreme. But it's not that makes it special. What makes it special is that it was printed with ink that was mixed with human ashes. And not just any human, but the writer of Squadron Supreme, Mark Grunwald. He is a comic book legend. He started working at Marvel in 1978 and stayed there until his death. He is most recognized for his work on this book. It's a team of heroes known as Squadron Supreme. The characters had already existed, but Grunwald took them and placed them in an alternate reality. The heroes unite to build this utopia on their planet, but things don't go exactly according to plan. And this is kind of like, this gritty take on superheroes is something we're really familiar with, but it was very new and very revolutionary back then. It's a 12-issue miniseries. It takes a look at the inner workings of superheroes in real-world settings where corruption and consequences are the focus. Many, like I said, consider it to be a precursor to popular superhero stories like Watchmen, Kingdom Come, The Boys. So if you like those, you can think Mark Grunwald. He died of heart failure in 1996. And long before that, he was telling his wife he wanted his ashes to be a part of his work. So when Squadron Supreme was collected into a trade paperback, they mixed his ashes into the ink, which, it's kind of creepy on one hand, but I think it's really cool that he lives on, so to speak, literally in his work.
Yeah, no, it's super cool. I mean, it's super cool that his wife took the steps to do that as well. And even working with you on the publishing side, I couldn't even imagine the process of that. Who are you talking to first? Are you? There's so many parties involved, right? Where you can't just go to
Right.
your publisher and be like, all right, we're going to need you to cremate a body. We're going to need you to put some ashes in some ink. We're going to need you to do this. There's so many steps involved that I feel like that's a whole nother part of the story that you could research and tell as a believe it or not.
For sure. It had to take a ton of, work to figure out, okay, what ratio of ashes to ink am I doing? And you only have so many ashes to work with. You can't just
Right?
keep, seeing what works. So yeah, from a production standpoint, that's a lot of work.
Curtis, do we have any other human ash stuff in our collection? I know we've got some art made out of some really strange things. And I know Colton and I have worked with or interviewed somebody that does paintings made out of human blood and ash, but do we own anything ourselves?
That's a good question. Off the top of my head, I can't think of anything specifically with human ashes. It's very possible that we have something with 30,000 items in our collection. Odds are in our favor that we might have something similar to that. I can tell you we do have other portraits made out of cigar ash. I know it's not exactly the same as human ash, but it's ash nonetheless. There's an artist in Mexico that recently did an entire portrait of all the Avengers. It's like a set of it's almost 15 canvases made entirely out of cigar ash. He painted all the Avengers. So while not necessarily human, it's in the same spirit, using an odd material to create a piece of art.
Interesting. And it just so happened to be comic book related too. That's really wild.
There you go.
Colton, what about you? What's your favorite exhibit in the collection of how many, Curtis? 35?
We have approximately 30 to 35,000, give or take. There's some flat wall art that's included in that and stuff like that. But yeah, we have I would say a good estimate's 30,000.
Wow, that's
And
awesome.
it's definitely hard to pick your favorite out of 30,000 things. I mean,
It's
we've got
gotta be.
again, like Curtis was saying,
Yes, it is.
like blaster to lightsaber to as expensive items all the way down. Obviously, I mean, being here at the corporate office, I think my favorite definitely changes from month to month, whether it be something we get in new that I'm really excited about, or it's something we're able to just uncover in, the archives and find out that we have this amazing thing that almost nobody in the company knew about until that moment. I think my most favorite one recently, though, it's an object we did for Ripley's Rarities, this little video series we do, that we do, where we kind of take an object out of the collection and do a little bit more research and do some video of it. But it was a mummy's foot. And normally when I, put this show together, I'll pick out a couple items that I think, kind of have, striking visuals, and I'll do the research kind of after I do the filming. So a mummy foot, I was like, there's got to be an interesting story about how this, foot got sawn off a mummy and ended up in the Ripley's collection. I'll get to that later, but let me, do some filming and stuff. So I, did the filming, I brought the footage back, and so it's processing, and I'm kind of trying to do research on this. Our provenance that we have for it says that it came from an 18th century physician in England. And, otherwise I just know that it's a mummy foot. And I kind of have the date range of where it's from. So I decided I'll just throw all those words into Google and see, maybe the internet will, kind of free associate some evidence together for me. And talk about serendipity. The kind of journey I went on, learning about this mummy foot was absolutely a believe it or not in and of itself. So obviously there's this whole history of, imperialists from Europe going down to Egypt and taking back souvenirs for, their curio cabinets and stuff like that. But I was able to find that there's actually this really famous short story about a mummy's foot that belonged to an 18th century physician. And so the story goes that he bought the mummy's foot, again, for his curio cabinet from the Shop of Curiosities. And then he goes to sleep and he has this dream where he meets the owner of the foot, which is a princess. It's this Egyptian princess, and her pharaoh father shows up in the dream. And it's this whole little kind of, romantic story, very in the flavor of, I would say, like a H.P. Lovecraft kind of story. It's got that, that creepiness of, the woman with the missing foot, but also these kind of, romantic era things going on. So this crazy story. But it turns out that the foot that is in our collection is actually from the same city in Egypt that this princess is in this story. It's the city of Armant. And it's actually also from the same time period that there was a very famous Egyptian princess in that city. And all of that on together, it's also in the ruins of that city, one of the few statues remaining are actually just the broken off legs and feet of a princess and this pharaoh man. So an absolutely wild story of happenstance. Like, obviously we have no way of knowing if this foot or this story is real or like really connected, but the possibilities seem to have, kind of collected together to make this incredible story where the, it being a physician matches, the time period matches, the time period of our foot matches, the story matches, all of these historical details coming together. And it creates this story that, again, it's my favorite right now. And obviously we're, running into believe it or nots like this all the time in our collection. But that for me, I think is the full Monty of, not only is it an ancient Egyptian mummy foot, but it's also got this incredible, story attached to it.
For sure. And it's a story that you got to kind of weave yourself and discover yourself. So I feel like that's got to have a little personal draw to you there.
Absolutely. You never know what you're going to find when you go through the Ripley's archives or where it's going to lead you, for sure.
That is very true. And Curtis, you're probably the one that spends the most time in the Ripley's archives and the Ripley's warehouse with our exhibits.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you can't just name one that's your favorite, but let's list them off.
Oh yeah, that's impossible, as Colton said, with 30,000 exhibits, and half of them are out in the field all the time, and and half of them are here in the warehouse. We're constantly changing. It changes daily. I think it would depend on the category. If you're thinking, history-wise, my favorite, believe it or not, or object for history is probably between a couple. I mean, we have hair from almost every president. If that's not cool enough, we have a whole bunch of other stuff. We've got like back here. This is Teddy Roosevelt's top hat. So Teddy Roosevelt was kind of an avid hat wearer. You can look up photos of Teddy Roosevelt, and he always had a hat of some kind or another on. And this was one of his top hats. We were able to acquire. Very cool because it's got his initials on it. It came with the carrying case as well. So that's probably one of my newer favorite historical items. But we also have really cool pieces. Kind of going back to what Colton said about sometimes the stories are cool and the way that they just weave in, and you can't really. It could have been this item. There's really no way to say yes or no. For example, we own the Derringer that John Wilkes Booth, the sister gun to the one that shot Lincoln. So basically, John Wilkes Booth went and assassinated Abraham Lincoln. He had 2 Derringers in his pocket. He had one that shot the president, and that one is in the Smithsonian. And there was another one that was in his pocket that was supposed to be a backup, and that was dropped in the barn that they ended up chasing him to. But it was dropped at a later time. They recovered it, and basically, there's really no way of kind of saying which gun killed Lincoln. I mean, they have an idea, but it's not like you can go and test the bullet that was in Lincoln's head like you can do nowadays with Crime Scene. That just didn't exist back then. So it kind of, that gun falls into this gray area where, could it have been the gun that killed Lincoln? Maybe it's the sister gun. He had it on him when he shot Lincoln. And although the Smithsonian says they have the one that killed Abraham Lincoln, there's really no major forensic evidence behind that. It's, and so it kind of is that gray area and the story behind the object.
We've gone from Star Wars to serial killers, and we had some sever feet involved there. So it's definitely been a whirlwind of some strange exhibits here. So that kind of covers a lot of what we do and why everything's such a believe it or not, and why kind of our exhibits have stood the test of time for 100 years. So, thank you, Colton, Curtis, and Jordy, for bringing all of this to light and really diving into how the Ripley's brand has expanded on that legacy of Robert Ripley, who was an explorer and a world traveler. And we're all doing that now from the comfort of our own homes and behind computer screens. Colton, you even said just throw some weird stuff in Google and see what comes back. And you never know kind of what you're going to find. I know personally, it's always a treat to kind of walk through the Ripley warehouse and take a peek at some of the really strange things in there. But walking around with any of you guys and your wealth of knowledge definitely is a whole nother experience. So it's worth the visit for sure. But that said, for all of you guys watching at home, we're going to give you the opportunity to do so after this panel. So if you jump onto our Twitch channel or our Facebook page, you're going to be able to have a peek at our warehouse. You can ask to see certain exhibits if we have them, ask us anything, have a quick follow-up Q&A. Like I said, I think you're definitely going to have questions because I still have plenty of questions. How can you not with this stuff? It's pretty wild. So thank you again, panelists. Jordy, Colton, Curtis, you guys have been awesome. And thank you, audience at home. We look forward to seeing you in our post-panel chat and in person, of course, at next year's San Diego Comic-Con. So stay safe, stay weird, and as always, believe it or not.